Julian Kane was a ghost billionaire, a man who ruled his empire with ice in his veins and a heart shuttered by grief. Untouchable. Unreachable. Until the night his world didn't just crack, it shattered. He walked into his high-security penthouse, expecting the silence of his own isolation. Instead, he heard a sound that shouldn't exist, a soft, rhythmic giggle. When he looked under the mahogany desk of his $100 million empire, he found a pair of bright eyes looking back at him. A baby, clutching the pen Julian used to sign billion-dollar deals, smiling as if he'd been waiting for him all along. In that moment, the man who feared everyone realized his fortress had been breached, not by an enemy, but by a miracle. Was it a coincidence that this child appeared just as Julian's life was falling apart? Or was it destiny calling from under a desk? Subscribe to Mafia Boss Empire Story, where we explore the moments that change everything. Settle in, this is Julian's turning point. The city lights of Manhattan looked like cold diamonds through the floor-to-ceiling glass. Julian didn't look at them. His eyes were fixed on the red numbers on his monitor. The hostile takeover was no longer a threat, it was a reality. His phone buzzed, a message from his legal team. They have the votes, Julian. It's over. The empire he had built with his late wife, Elena, was slipping through his fingers like sand. For the first time in 5 years, Julian let his guard down. He whispered into the empty, dark room, "I'm alone, Elena. I can't hold it together anymore." Then, he heard it. Coup. Julian froze. His security was biometric. His floor was restricted. He stood slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound came again, a soft, wet gurgle from beneath the desk. He pushed his chair back, expecting a corporate spy or an assassin. Instead, he found Leo. Julian stared at the toddler, his breath hitching in a way that felt like a physical blow to his ribs. He had spent 5 years perfecting a fortress of ice, a cold and calculated existence where every variable was controlled and every emotion was buried under the weight of mahogany and steel. But as Leo sat there, clutching Julian's $5,000 fountain pen with a sticky, triumphant grip, the billionaire felt a hairline fracture spread across his resolve. The child's smile was the problem. It wasn't just a gesture of infant joy, it was a ghost. The way the corners of Leo's eyes crinkled and the specific, radiant warmth of that expression was a carbon copy of Elena's. It was the smile that used to greet Julian at the door of their first apartment, long before the billions and the skyscrapers, and seeing it now, on a child who shouldn't even be in this room, felt like a haunting. "Give me that," Julian commanded, his voice intended to be the sharp, authoritative bark that made CEOs tremble. Instead, it came out as a raspy whisper. Leo didn't flinch. Instead, he let out a melodic, bubbling giggle and held the pen higher, as if offering it back as a peace treaty. Julian reached out, his hand hovering inches from the child's small, chubby fingers. He should be calling security. He should be demanding to know how a Maid's son had bypassed the biometric locks of the most secure penthouse in the city. His board of directors was currently voting to strip him of his life's work, and here he was, crouched on a Persian rug, locked in a stalemate with a toddler. "You're a distraction," Julian muttered, finally closing his hand over the pen. He tried to pull it away with professional firmness, but Leo gripped tighter, his tiny face scrunching into a look of stubborn determination that mirrored Julian's own. For a second, the corporate war outside those doors ceased to exist. The looming hostile takeover, the betrayal of his closest advisors, the red numbers on his monitors, it all faded into the background hum of the city. Julian looked into Leo's bright, fearless eyes and saw something he hadn't realized he was missing: life. Unfiltered, unburdened, and terrifyingly pure life. He managed to retrieve the pen, but as he stood up to return to his desk, he felt a small, warm weight press against his tailored trouser leg. Leo had crawled forward and was now hugging Julian's knee, looking up with that same, hauntingly familiar radiance. Julian froze, his hands trembling. He wanted to push the child away, to rebuild the wall and return to his safe, silent grief. But as the child's warmth seeped through the expensive fabric of his suit, Julian realized the ice was already melting, and for the first time in 5 years, the ghost billionaire felt the painful, beautiful sting of a heart starting to beat again. The heavy silence of the office was suddenly broken by the frantic sound of heels clicking against the marble hallway, followed by a soft, hesitant knock that seemed to vibrate with terror. Julian didn't move, his hand still resting tentatively near Leo's shoulder. The door creaked open just an inch, and a woman's face appeared, pale, breathless, and framed by loose strands of dark hair that had escaped a neat bun. It was Sarah, the quiet woman from the custodial staff whom Julian had passed 1,000 times without ever truly seeing. Her eyes darted to the floor, widening as she saw her son leaning against the legs of the most feared man in the corporate world. "Mr. Kane, I am so sorry," she gasped, rushing into the room with her head bowed, her hands trembling as she reached for Leo. "The daycare was closed, and I couldn't. I didn't have anyone else. I thought if I kept him in the break room for just 1 hour while I finished the floor. I didn't know he could crawl that fast. Please, don't fire me." She scooped the child into her arms, clutching him as if he were a shield. Julian stood slowly, smoothing the wrinkles in his suit, his face returning to the mask of the man of stone. He opened his mouth to deliver the standard lecture on security breaches and corporate liability, but the words died in his throat. Up close, he saw the exhaustion etched into the hollows of her cheeks and the faint, unmistakable redness around her eyes. "You're alone," Julian said, though it wasn't a question. Sarah froze, her grip tightening on Leo. She looked up, and for a fleeting second, the professional barrier between billionaire and employee vanished. "My husband, he passed away last year," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's just us. I'm trying, Mr. Kane. I promise it won't happen again." The air in the room suddenly felt thin. Julian looked from Sarah's desperate gaze to the child in her arms, who was now reaching back toward Julian with a playful whimper. The mirror was perfect. She wasn't just a staff member, she was a fellow survivor of a wreck that left the world feeling hollow. He recognized the specific shadow in her eyes, the same one he saw every morning in his own reflection. It was the crushing weight of being the only person left to hold a ceiling up that wanted to fall. "I know," Julian murmured, the admission feeling like a confession. He looked at his desk, where the city lights continued to hum with a cold, indifferent energy. "I know exactly what it's like to be the only one left." He didn't call security. He didn't sign a termination slip. Instead, Julian turned back to his monitors, his voice low but no longer sharp. "Sit down, Sarah. The halls are crawling with board members who would love a scandal. Stay here until the building clears." As she sank into a leather chair, stunned into silence, Julian realized the fortress was no longer empty. The wall hadn't just been breached, it had been shared. The office had transformed into a strange, quiet sanctuary. While the world outside the reinforced glass remained a cold blur of ambition and betrayal, the space within the penthouse felt heavy with a newfound, fragile peace. Sarah sat at the edge of the velvet sofa, her hands clasped tightly as she watched Leo, who had grown bored of the carpet fibers and was now eyeing the glowing light of Julian's executive tablet. Julian hadn't returned to his work. Instead, he watched the child from the shadows of his desk, the blue light of the monitors casting sharp angles across his face. "He's curious," Julian remarked, his voice devoid of its usual frost. "He likes lights," Sarah replied softly, her eyes never leaving her son. "He thinks the world is just one big game to be figured out." Julian leaned forward, sliding the sleek, glass device across the mahogany surface toward the edge of the desk. "Let's see how he handles a $100 million interface." Leo's eyes widened as the screen flickered to life. With a squeal of delight, he reached out, his small, uncoordinated fingers slapping against the glass. To any onlooker, it was chaos, a child's random movements across an encrypted network. But as Leo's palm pressed against a specific corner of the screen, the tablet let out a sharp, digital chirp. Julian's posture stiffened. He moved closer, his professional instinct overriding his curiosity. Leo had somehow bypassed the primary lock screen, his messy swipes triggering a gesture-based shortcut Julian had forgotten he'd even programmed. The screen began to scroll through thousands of lines of code and nested folders at a dizzying speed. Suddenly, Leo's finger held firm on a tiny, unmarked icon, a ghost file hidden deep within the system's directory. The tablet froze for a heartbeat before expanding into a sprawling map of offshore accounts and encrypted ledger entries. Julian's breath hitched. "Wait," he whispered, gently lifting the tablet from Leo's reach. He had tasked his top cybersecurity team for months to find the source of the bleeding capital that was destabilizing his firm. They had told him the trail was cold, a ghost in the machine. But there, highlighted by a toddler's accidental touch, was the Project Icarus folder. It wasn't just a loss of funds, it was a roadmap of internal theft, signed with digital keys that belonged to his most trusted advisors. Julian looked at the data, then back at Leo, who was now contentedly chewing on the sleeve of his own shirt. The child had done in seconds what a dozen Ivy League graduates claimed was impossible. Julian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the office's air conditioning. The betrayal was no longer a theory, it was a visible, undeniable truth. "Sarah," Julian said, his voice turning low and dangerous, though his eyes remained on the child. "Your son didn't just break into my office tonight. He just handed me the keys to the kingdom." Julian leaned back, his gaze shifting from the glowing evidence on the tablet to the woman sitting on his sofa. For years, he had operated from a mountain peak, looking at his company as a series of spreadsheets, logistics, and quarterly yields. Sarah was a name on a payroll list he never read, employee number 4402, yet here she was, the mother of the child who had just pierced through a digital veil his most expensive experts couldn't touch. "How long have you worked for Kane International, Sarah?" he asked. His voice wasn't a cross-examination, it was a quiet, haunting realization of his own ignorance. Sarah straightened her posture, her hands still protective around Leo. 3 years, sir. I started in the West Wing maintenance crew, then moved to night shifts here in the executive suite after my husband's accident. Julian felt a pang of phantom guilt. 3 years. She had cleaned his floors, emptied his trash, and moved through his private world while he mourned Elena in a vacuum of self-pity. He had walked past her in the hallways, likely brushing shoulders with the very person who carried the secret to his company's salvation, and he hadn't even known her last name. He pulled up her employee file on his secondary monitor. It was a bleak, clinical summary of a life under pressure. Commendations for perfect attendance. 0 disciplinary actions. And a salary that, when calculated against the cost of living and medical debt, was a slow-motion tragedy. He saw the record of her husband's death, a factory floor incident in a subsidiary he had shuttered for efficiency 18 months ago. The realization hit him like a physical weight. He had been a blind king, ruling over a kingdom of ghosts. He had optimized his profits by crushing the very people who were now his only shield against a coup. Sarah wasn't just a maid, she was a casualty of the ruthless Julian Kane he had become to mask his grief. "You were there," Julian whispered, more to himself than to her. "The day the Holloway plant closed. I signed that order." Sarah looked down at Leo's head, her voice small but steady. "We all have to make choices to survive, Mr. Kane. I don't blame you for the world being the way it is. I just needed to make sure he had a future." Julian looked at the child, then at the mother, and finally at the mahogany desk that felt like an altar to a god that no longer answered. He had spent 5 years guarding a fortress, only to realize he had locked himself in with the wrong people. The traitors wore Italian suits and drank his scotch, while the loyal were invisible, carrying their children through the shadows of his office. "The world is going to change tonight, Sarah," Julian said, his eyes hardening with a new kind of resolve. "And for the first time, I'm going to make sure it changes for the people who actually keep it running." The office air, once thick with the stagnant scent of old grief and expensive scotch, now felt electrified with a cold, predatory clarity. Julian sat at his desk, his fingers flying across the glass interface of the tablet Leo had so innocently unlocked. Beside him, Sarah stood in a daze of disbelief, while Leo, oblivious to the storm he had unleashed, had fallen into a peaceful slumber in the crook of her arm. The data was a masterpiece of deception. Julian watched as the screen populated with a complex web of shell subcorporations and diverted capital. It was a slow-motion heist, executed with the surgical precision of someone who knew exactly where the blind spots in Julian's security lay. For months, he had been looking for a ghost in the machine, but the tablet revealed a much more human monster. The digital signatures weren't coming from an external hacker. They belonged to Arthur Sterling, Julian's mentor, his chief financial advisor, and the man who had stood by his side at Elena's funeral. Julian's jaw tightened until it ached. "He waited until I was at my weakest," Julian whispered, the words tasting like ash. "He knew that while I was staring at the walls of this office, I wouldn't be looking at the books." The Project Icarus folder was more than just a ledger of stolen funds, it was a countdown. Sterling hadn't just been stealing, he had been funneling money into a hostile entity designed to buy out the board's distressed shares on Monday morning. The plan was to bankrupt Julian emotionally and financially, then swoop in as the savior of the company Elena had helped build. Every failed interpretation, every untraceable loss, and every piece of bad news Julian had received over the last year had been a carefully scripted lie. Julian felt a surge of rage so pure it threatened to overwhelm him, but then his gaze fell on the sleeping child. Leo's chest rose and fell in a rhythmic, trusting cadence. This child, the son of a woman his company had marginalized, had just stripped away the masks of the most powerful men in his circle. He didn't call the police. Not yet. He needed to be as surgical as Sterling had been. Julian began to move with a renewed, lethal purpose, his eyes reflecting the blue glow of the hidden files. He began rerouting the diverted funds, pulling the digital strings to trap Sterling in the very labyrinth he had created. "Sarah," Julian said, his voice a low vibration of resolve. "Your son didn't just find a folder. He found the knife in my back." He looked at the digital trail, a glowing map of betrayal that reached into every corner of his empire. The ghost billionaire was gone. In his place was a man who finally had a reason to fight, not for his pride, but for the legacy of the woman he loved and the future of the child who had found him in the dark. The boardroom was a tomb of glass and shadow, smelling of expensive cologne and the metallic tang of hidden fear. Julian entered not with his usual predatory stride, but with a measured, haunting stillness. Behind him, the double doors clicked shut, a sound like a guillotine blade hitting the block. Arthur Sterling sat at the head of the long obsidian table, his face a practiced mask of grandfatherly concern. "Julian," he began, his voice smooth as silk. "We were just discussing the transition. The board feels that, given your recent distractions, a change in leadership is the only way to stabilize the stock." Julian didn't sit. He walked to the head of the table, leaning his knuckles against the polished surface. He looked at each director, men and women he had known for decades, some who were looking at their laps, and others, like Sterling, who stared him down with hungry eyes. "I've spent 5 years building walls," Julian said, his voice low and vibrating with a terrifying clarity. "I thought if I made this company a fortress, I could keep the world out. I thought if I was ruthless enough, I wouldn't have to feel the sting of betrayal again." He slid the tablet into the center of the table. The screen flickered to life, projecting a holographic map of Project Icarus, the offshore accounts, the diverted millions, and the digital fingerprints of Arthur Sterling. The room went deathly silent. Sterling's face didn't just pale, it seemed to age 10 years in a heartbeat. "Arthur, you didn't just steal money," Julian continued, his gaze locking onto his mentors. "You stole the hope of every family that relies on this firm. You bet against our people because you thought I was too broken to notice." A younger director, one who hadn't been part of the scheme, began to speak, but Julian held up a hand. The room braced for the explosion, the legal firestorm Julian was famous for. But it never came. "I could destroy you all," Julian murmured. I have enough evidence here to ensure none of you ever see the sun from outside a prison cell. That is what the ghost billionaire would do. He paused, a ghost of Leo's innocent smile flickering in his mind. But tonight, a child showed me that a fortress is just a fancy word for a cage. I'm not firing the board. I'm dissolving the old vision. He turned to the non-traders. From this moment, Kane International is no longer a machine for profit at any cost. We are going to rebuild the Holloway plant. We are going to provide childcare, healthcare, and dignity to the people who actually clean these floors and build these machines. If you want to stay, you stay to serve them. If you want to leave, Arthur will show you the door on his way to the authorities. The lion had spoken, but for the first time, he hadn't roared to kill. He had roared to protect. Julian walked out of the room without looking back, leaving the traders in the wreckage of their own greed, finally understanding that true power wasn't found in what you could take, but in what you chose to save. The following evening, Julian found himself standing on a cracked sidewalk in a part of the city where the neon lights didn't signify luxury, but survival. He had insisted on personally escorting Sarah and Leo home, driven by a restless compulsion to see the life he had unwittingly helped dismantle. He looked up at the towering, weathered apartment complex, a stark contrast to the glass and steel monolith of his own penthouse. As Sarah led him up 3 flights of stairs that smelled of industrial floor wax and cheap laundry detergent, Julian felt the suffocating weight of his own isolation. He stepped into her apartment and stopped. It was a single room, smaller than his walk-in closet, yet it was filled with a vibrant, agonizing warmth. A few plastic toys were neatly lined up against a peeling baseboard, a small table held a single candle and a framed photo of a man with the same stubborn chin as Leo. "It's not much," Sarah said, her voice tight with a mix of pride and shame as she set a sleeping Leo into a small, makeshift crib. "But it's ours. We've made it work." Julian walked to the window. There was no panoramic view of the skyline here, only the brick wall of the neighboring building and the muffled roar of the subway beneath the street. He realized then that for 5 years, he had been living in a golden cage, surrounded by people who served his ego while he nursed a grief that had become his only identity. He had called his penthouse a fortress, but standing in this cramped, honest space, he saw it for what it truly was, a prison. He turned to look at Sarah, who was folding a small, worn blanket. In the dim light, she looked like a giant, her strength dwarfing the limitations of the room. Julian had spent millions trying to buy peace, yet this woman had cultivated it in the middle of a storm he had helped create. "I thought I was protecting myself by staying up there," Julian whispered, his voice cracking the silence of the room. "But I was just fading away. I didn't see the world because I was too busy making sure the world couldn't see me." He reached out, his hand brushing the rough fabric of a curtain. He thought of the empty, echoing halls of his estate, the silent dinners, and the cold bed. He had been a king of nothing. "Sarah," he said, turning to her with a look of terrifying clarity. "I didn't come here just to drop you off. I came here because I realized I can't go back to the way things were. I've spent enough time in the dark." The ghost billionaire was dead, left behind in the sterile air of the 50th floor. As he looked at the sleeping child and the woman who had survived his coldness, Julian finally understood that the real world wasn't a place to be feared, it was a place to be lived in, even if the walls were thin and the lights were dim. The transition from the cramped apartment to the sprawling Kane estate happened in a blur of motion that Julian orchestrated with the same efficiency he used for a corporate merger. He told himself it was purely logistical. The board was in shambles, Arthur Sterling's allies were still lurking in the shadows, and Sarah was a witness, a target. Moving her and Leo into the guest annex wasn't an act of charity, it was a security protocol. But as the heavy iron gates of the estate swung open, Julian felt a surge of anxiety that had nothing to do with corporate raiders. He watched from the rearview mirror as Leo pressed his small face against the window, his eyes wide at the sight of the manicured lawns and the stone fountain that had been dry since Elena's death. "The annex has its own entrance," Julian said, his voice stiff as they stepped into the echoing grand foyer. "It's private. You'll have a full kitchen, and the staff has been instructed to provide whatever the boy needs. It's safer this way. Until the legal proceedings against Sterling are finalized. Sarah stood in the center of the hall, looking up at the vaulted ceilings and the portraits of Kane ancestors who seemed to stare down with cold, aristocratic judgment. She looked smaller here than she had in her apartment, but her gaze remained steady. "Thank you, Mr. Kane. We'll stay out of your way." "That isn't necessary," Julian blurted out, the words escaping before he could filter them. He cleared his throat, adjusting his cufflinks. "The house is quiet. Too quiet. It's bad for morale." The first night was an adjustment. Julian sat in his formal dining room, the silence usually so heavy it felt like a physical weight. But then, through the vents and the thick oak doors, he heard it, a distant, muffled shriek of laughter, followed by the frantic pitter-patter of small feet against the hardwood of the annex. He found himself setting down his wine glass, his head tilting toward the sound. The silence he had guarded so fiercely for 5 years was being systematically dismantled by a toddler who didn't understand the concept of a ghost billionaire. Later that evening, he walked toward the annex under the guise of checking the perimeter. He stopped at the glass doors and saw Sarah sitting on the floor, reading a book to Leo by the light of a single lamp. The room looked different, warm, cluttered, and alive. Julian didn't knock. He just stood in the shadows of the hallway, leaning his head against the cold stone wall. For the first time since the funeral, the house didn't feel like a mausoleum. He wasn't protecting them from the world, they were protecting him from the silence. He closed his eyes, letting the sound of Sarah's soft voice drift through the door, and realized that his fortress was finally becoming a home. The golden sunlight of a late September afternoon spilled across the mahogany desk, but the office was no longer a tomb. The air was filled with the scent of jasmine tea and the faint, chaotic soundtrack of life. Julian Kane sat in his chair, not as a ghost, but as a man anchored to the present. He picked up a silver-framed photograph that had long ago replaced the cold, jagged shadow of the $10 million statue. In the photo, taken on the grounds of the estate, Sarah was laughing, her hair windswept and free, while a 5-year-old Leo sat perched on Julian's shoulders, triumphantly waving a wooden airplane. Julian looked at his own face in the reflection. The lines around his eyes were deeper, but they were lines etched by smiles, not by the rhythmic grinding of teeth in the dark. He looked toward the corner of the room where the shattered remains of the gold statue had once been swept away. For years, he had believed that piece of metal represented his strength, his legacy, and his protection. He had thought that by surrounding himself with indestructible things, he could become indestructible himself. He realized now that the statue hadn't been a tribute to his success, it had been a monument to his ego, a heavy, gilded barrier that kept the world at a distance. The office door pushed open without a knock. Leo, now tall for his age and bursting with the same fearless energy that had once led him under a desk, ran inside. "Dad, Mom says the foundation gala starts in an hour. You're still in your work suit." Julian stood, a genuine warmth spreading through his chest. He looked at the boy, the miracle, who had breached his security with nothing but a gummy smile, and then at Sarah, who appeared in the doorway, her presence the steady heartbeat of his new life. She wasn't an employee, and she was no longer a ghost in his hallways. She was the partner who had taught him that mercy was more powerful than firewalls. He realized then that the rude boss had died the moment that gold shattered on the marble floor. That expensive, hollow idol had to break so that his heart could finally open. The loss of the $10 million had been the cheapest price he had ever paid for something of value. "I'm coming," Julian said, his voice rich and steady. He took Sarah's hand as they walked toward the door, leaving the silent penthouse behind. He didn't look back at the desk or the monitors. He didn't need a fortress anymore. He had a home, he had a purpose, and most importantly, he had the familiar smile of a family that had saved him from the most dangerous enemy of all, himself.